Hi, sir. Just reached home and logged in, so I'm on the session now. Yes, sir. Done, sir. Done. So I've joined, sir. All right, sir. Thanks.
Good evening and welcome to Reach Lawyer Source. Reach Lawyer Source is a program of Reach Lawyer to discuss, debate, support issues and challenges faced by women at home, at workplace, and in the society. Untangled, Setting Her Free is a series of talks on the issues around domestic violence. Today's topic, resuscitating. Welcome to Reach Lawyer Source. I would now like to hand over the session to our moderator, Ms. Tusharika Vik. Tusharika, over to you.
Thank you, Nitin. Welcome everyone to the third day of the Untangled Setting Her Free talk show series. The theme of today's session is resuscitating. Very recently, the world reeled under the pandemic. Yes, we are breathing a little easy now, but it was so difficult for so many women who are in abusive relationships. Misery is heaped on them. The abuser was at home all the time. There was no respite, no breathing space. They felt choked and often suffocated. They were trapped not just within the four walls of their home, but they were trapped in their minds as well. With economic challenges increasing every day, every frustration was taken out on them. The constant abuse has virtually shredded the person of many women to bits. Many have taken their lives, but unfortunately, their stories are lost in the noise of the pandemic. There is a need to understand. There is a need to hear their stories. There is a need to resuscitate their broken lives. With this, I now call upon Mr. Bt Venkatesh. Bt Venkatesh is a litigating lawyer, activist, speaker, writer of more than 3 decades of experience, a former state public prosecutor, and one who is known for his decades of work on human rights in India. He is also the founder of Reach Lawyer, a community of lawyers, academics, journalists, activists, students, professionals, and all those who are concerned about human rights. Sir, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. Today, I have a challenge. Today, Dr. Sarsu Thomas was supposed to deliver the lecture, and she could not come because of the sad demise of her father. So, for that particular situation, it will be extremely, we all heartfelt condolences to Dr. Sarsu Thomas, and dissolve this, please. We, on this day, continue with our discussion of resuscitating. In fact, this was a very dear subject of Dr. Sarsu Thomas, who had written serious articles, paper on the aspect of impact of pandemic on women facing domestic violence, women in domestic violence. And that makes it so difficult. We, in the course of the years of pandemic, millions of women face so much more violence because of the pandemic, because the abuser was at home. The abuse was constant. And this was a very extraordinary study that was conducted, which Dr. Sarsu was discussed on. She'll certainly come on the occasion, certainly invite from Rich Lawyer to her to come and present us on the aspects of the studies that she had done on this issue. Today with us to discuss the very subject, or with us an august presence of Miss Smita, an auditor, and that's a very small word to say. She is a person of great empathy, a constitutionalist, one who believes in human rights. We have Mr. Saurabh, and Mr. Saurabh Ashok Maridas is a lawyer and presently working as a project officer in Samvad in National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences. He's an amazing person. He's been training hundreds of officers across the country in respect of the rights of the children, more particularly in respect of protection of children from child sexual abuse. And today we have the third panelist who is with us, is Prerna Dadu. Prerna Dadu is a graduate in law, and she is presently an attorney practicing at Pune, and she's now here with us to discuss the same. Ms. Prerna Dadu is passionate about human rights, and her body of work so far speaks volumes about the same. So is the case of Mr. Saurabh Ashok Maridas. And today we have these distinguished guests with us to discuss on the subject. And joining them are Ms. Mamta Ram, a law student from St. Joseph College of Law, and Ms. Gargi Kar, who is a student of George College of Law, Kolkata. And we have Tusharika, she is the moderator for the program. So I request the panelists to open up the discussion on the subject. I will request the moderator to take over the program and run the program. Ms. Tusharika.
Thank you, sir. So we'll start with the first speaker of today. Ms. Smita, you can start. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tusharika. Good evening to one and all. Yes, Bt Venkatesh sir did define a lot of things after my name. Yes, what I would like to emphasize here is, yes, I empathize with the topic. COVID was a pandemic, yes, but it came along with it. It brought about a shadow pandemic, and that shadow pandemic is what we would be discussing today. So this was very sudden, and throughout the world, globally, if you see globally, the violence, the domestic violence on women, especially, has been reported globally. So there was a steep hike during the lockdown periods, especially in India. It was too sudden, And there was no reaction time out here for many women. We got to read stories of women where they said that they had all plans of leaving their spouses because of violence, abusive relationships. And as there was no time, it was a very short notice or no notice at all. So this, made them actually prisoners in those relationships for a long time. And that is a very sad part. When we talk about abusive relationship, it need not be a woman alone here, right? Even children are, targeted, and also the senior citizens also. Yes. So work from home, I think, was a culprit here. And also all of a sudden, all of us were prisoners, literally prisoners, and we didn't know how to respond to a situation like that. And there was one more aspect here where, alcoholics had a lot of problems because all the liquor shops and other things were closed. So what you say, the reactions to not having their usual dose also brought about a lot of violent behavior from these people. And that was again the target, were the very easy targets were women and children. When we talk about this particular aspect in the COVID situation, how it was, so it is nothing but we have an offender who's already a violent offender, and we have a very easy target, a visible, accessible, easy target, and these people, means the targets, the victims, have they always find somewhere outside, like the families or friends or their own parents as guardians. And during the lockdown, that guardian help was missing. So this actually increased, what you say, the effect it had on the victims. So as we know that, when we say guardians, we also know that the police were here very much busy with controlling the lockdown and keeping everybody inside rather than helping such situations. And also there are NGOs who are also very actively taking part in trying to help people out with the COVID pandemic and not this shadow pandemic. So in such a scenario, the victims who are very vulnerable, especially the women, were caught. And yes, today it has eased a little bit, but still the work from home scenario for most of the industries, the IT industry continues, whereas the others can get out freely. So Tusharika, you can go ahead and ask me questions. That would be better. Thank you.
I'd now request the audience to put down any questions if they have. Ma'am, we'll take up all the questions towards the end when all the three speakers are done.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We'll now move on to the second speaker, who is Saurabh Ashok, sir. Sir, the time is yours.
Thanks to Sharika. I don't have too many things to say about domestic violence, especially during COVID, particularly because my usual point of reference is with regard to children. I know we'll be discussing some of those issues in our next session as well. But just a couple of things, and I think ma'am very rightly made the point about how domestic violence really has more to do with family dynamics and the structures of most of our families than, say, the typical construct of who a victim of domestic violence is supposed to be. So given the family structures that we have, and these are typically, we've all talked about the patriarchy at length, and how a family, our entire systems of what a family is supposed to look like, who's supposed to bear responsibility in the family, and what the dynamics are supposed to look like, what the roles and responsibilities are supposed to look like, and how all of that is a product of the patriarchal system in which our society is supposed to exist. So we know this on one hand. We know what the patriarchy is supposed to do for various kinds of social relations, and family dynamics are no exception to those social relations. But stemming out of that is also this issue of domestic violence. So I don't think we can separate domestic violence from that larger context, which is why I thought the point that was also raised about how this is not just an issue of who we think is a victim of domestic violence. When we talk about domestic violence, we have to talk about this context in which it's happening. That's where I think something like COVID plays quite an important role, because what COVID has done is it's forced a certain rearrangement of the roles and responsibilities at home, especially if you're talking about an upper middle class context. Then it's people who can work from home, but of course for a majority of people, work from home is not really a choice. But even for them, for people who haven't been able to work from home during the pandemic and have had to go about their work, which involves a lot of physical labor in many instances, even in that context, COVID has of course resulted in more responsibility, simply because, for example, a family that is used to certain child rearing functions being taken over by state-led agencies, whether it is the child being able to spend more time in an Anganwadi, or whether it is the child being able to spend more time in any other child care or a residential or any other care setting. When that is taken away, when a lot of those services that were sort of easing some of the roles and responsibilities in the home are taken away, then that also increases and again rearranges the roles and responsibilities that the parents have, and that again influences the dynamics of what a home is supposed to look like. If there are more roles and responsibilities and we're talking about a patriarchal family setup, then certainly it's more often than not, it's not going to be the man of the house in that sense taking up these responsibilities. So then we come back to what has COVID done in terms of rearranging roles and responsibilities in the family, in terms of shaping relations within the family, and what impact does that have on the most vulnerable in that family. And then in that context, we see this plays out in typically gendered ways. So it is the girl child in most homes that is going to have to take on perhaps more additional responsibilities. For many children, that's meant dropping out of schools, not being able to have access to schools, or even if they're enrolled in schools, not being able to really substantively study because they have all these additional responsibilities at home. For the parents, that again has a gendered impact, because again it's typically the woman who's required to take on more of these responsibilities. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is because this is all also very quite important when we talk about domestic violence, because the increase in domestic violence, which I think has been reported across different countries, especially during the COVID, hasn't stemmed out of nowhere. That increase in violence has also come about as a result of these change in dynamics in the house, these change in the relations between parents, between spouses, and with their children, with the services available in terms of childcare and so on. So those change in family dynamics and relations necessarily have an impact on the uptick in violence also, because there's a certain expectation of what a wife is supposed to do at home. There's a certain expectation of what my daughter is supposed to do at home. And if those expectations aren't met, then typically the response is in many cases violent. Apart from this, we also have situations, where domestic violence in many cases, I think this was touched upon briefly, that there are the age-old issues of alcoholism, there are the age-old issues of mental health issues that contribute to, to poor resolving of conflicts within the house, poor resolving of disputes and so on. So I think keeping in mind, I think it's important to keep in mind the dynamics of what a family is supposed to look like, especially in the Indian context, for us to really understand why domestic violence is an issue and who it's supposed to affect. I think a related point there is to understand who the victim is supposed to be, and how victim is supposed to operate in a context of domestic violence. It's very easy for us to feel deeply distressed and feel extremely anguished about who we think the battered woman is, and we have this conception in our mind of who the victim of domestic violence is supposed to be, and for that victim we have unqualified support. We say that this is extremely wrong, and it's very easy for us to then say I pledge my unqualified support. I think this is extremely wrong. Part of the problem with domestic violence is also how limited that conversation is, because the victim in many cases of domestic violence isn't just who we expect or hope for it to be, or who's easy for us to understand. What happens, for example, to I think that for at least law school students, I'm sure everyone has seen this, and others have also heard this case, the Ahluwalia case. Perhaps I'm sure many people have heard about it at some point in law school, at least. The Ahluwalia case, was this case in, I think, Canada, if I'm not mistaken, where it was a case of years and years of domestic violence. And this woman who had endured violence over a significant period of time, quite severe violence. Her children were also subjected to violence. And one fine day, she can't take the violence anymore, so she douses her husband in with petrol and she lights him on fire. And then the question became about her defense to what was essentially an allegation of murder. What was her defense? And then the law had to deal with the fact that she's not really a victim because she's an offender. She's clearly committed murder, but this also happened in the context of long-standing domestic violence. So how do we deal with this person? And the law, for the life of it, could not fathom the idea of cumulative provocation, because only grave and sudden provocation matters to the law. If something happens instantaneously, the law will offer you a defense and say that, okay, you weren't in your right, you weren't thinking like a rational person, we give you this defense, and perhaps the punishment for you should be lesser, maybe culpable homicide not amounting to murder. But if it's cumulative provocation, which is domestic violence endured over years, then the law is confused and doesn't know how to respond. And that really tells us a lot about how we understand domestic violence also, because we expect the victim to be a certain way, we expect them to respond a certain way. But if your response is in itself committing an offense, or if your response is in itself violent, then society and the law don't really know how to deal with you. Like, are you supposed to be a victim of domestic violence or not? But that clearly is a victim of domestic violence, irrespective of what their final actions were or what they did. Apart from that, you can look at this in a child context also. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but it was reported in the media a couple of months ago. Basically, this girl who had poisoned almost everybody in her family. And I think it was only her, this happened in Karnataka, and it was only her brother who survived. This is the basic facts about the offense. From a legal standpoint, we'll say that, this is the offense. Whatever she tried to poison her family, many of them died. So it's clearly murder and whatever else. And her brother survived. But behind that incident, there's a history of her being berated and treated very poorly by her family, of her being made to discontinue her education. I think she had some learning difficulties, so she was also stigmatized compared to her siblings. She wasn't allowed to continue study. She was made to work. She was basically humiliated by her parents, and she had stayed with her grandparents for a bit. It was a very difficult family situation. She clearly had issues that probably also had mental health implications over a prolonged period of time, none of which was addressed. But the response, or the legal system, takes notice of this only when she's committed the offense. Now, the question here again we ask is this an offender or is this the victim? If we have to take a slightly nuanced perspective of what domestic violence is, we cannot come to a conclusion that this person is an offender only and not a victim. So when we discuss domestic violence, we also at some level have to factor in what context are we talking about. We are talking about the Indian family system, which is patriarchal, which is gendered, which is many things. And that results in certain relations and dynamics in the family, which contribute to things like domestic violence, which are also exacerbated in the context of COVID. That's one part. The other part is to seriously revisit who we consider to be the victim of domestic violence, because the victim of domestic violence may not always fit within our conception, but these are clearly individuals who are victimized by, prolonged periods of violence, or just, and it doesn't necessarily have to be physical abuse or sexual abuse. Many cases, emotional abuse also takes its toll. So I think these are just, a few thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We'll definitely talk on the aspects that you touched in our open discussion session. So now I'll call upon the third speaker of the day, Ms. Prerna Dadu. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I think both the speakers before me have very well spoken about this issue. But what I will add is that, yes, while the pandemic has sort of drawn our attention more to intimate partner violence, because the lack of being able to get out of such a situation, domestic violence is also something that goes vastly underreported because of the way our families and the culture around us is sort of shaped. Because and this goes hand in hand with a lot of sexual crimes, right? Because a lot of times it is your own family members that are the perpetrators of it. Intimate partner violence is your own family, and your own family sometimes can be the reason why you don't report it, because there is a stigma about what happens if the marriage ends and what people around you will think about that. So one is definitely that, even though pandemic did force us to think about this issue a little more seriously, this is something that's been going on for a while, and language of the law has been failing to protect its victims for a while now. And as Saurabh mentioned, it's not necessarily just women. And I think this narrative also that intimate partner violence affects women the most also re-victimizes women to a large extent, right? Maybe people that are trying to move forward or deal with their trauma in a certain way, when it starts to paint them as people whose lives have ended or whose lives cannot continue to go on any further, that also affects the way reporting works, right? Because in media, in culture, in your own families, you are now seen as somebody whose life has just been affected so badly that it is impossible to carry on or impossible to move beyond it, right? So I think using a sort of language that ends up re-victimizing the victims of people of intimate partner violence isn't really helping, right? And the other thing is definitely the lack of trauma response in our country. I hardly think that police has been a very helpful factor in responding to calls, of intimate partner violence. Either they're not fast enough or they're not efficient enough. And I myself, in my previous work, have seen that the language they themselves use. And we all know the state of corruption and the bureaucracy of this country that it takes to get any case even registered, right? Let alone to let due process or the forms of justice take it forward. And NGOs have very limited resources. There is very little that they themselves can do. So I think the lack of trauma centers or response centers in our country is a very concerning situation, right? Because even if people did want to report it and did want to get out of the situation, there is very few avenues that would help them to do so. And pandemic made that even worse. I remember reading some article that if on a video call somebody is making like a sign with their hands, I don't remember exactly what it was, but there were ways of communicating that what was happening, right? But there is very little ways of how you can get that across to more and more people. So that was also limited to, say, women or people from a certain class background, caste background, access to technology. It was limited, right? So I myself have sort of I've seen this information when I've gone to a club, and in the ladies' washroom there is a poster that says you order an angel shot. And that's when the people at the bar will know that you're with somebody that is hurting you, and they will try to do something to take you out of that situation, right? So again, that was aimed only at people that use the female washroom. Or again, it is very hard to sort of make this more accessible, and I see it. But I also think that it is necessary that we move beyond targeting just women, or as Saurabh very well said. So yeah, from having very little access to help also means that the cycle of trauma continues. It does perpetuate. It becomes a language of love. With even, say, Bollywood movies or other movies that sort of show it, there are ways in which we can't even identify what domestic violence is because of sort of the lack of education around it, right? It's not just a physical altercation. There are ways of it being so intricately emotional that we don't even have the bandwidth to understand it because of our limitations of access to education or language as such, right? So yeah, these are the few things that I wanted to add to the conversation, and I'm excited to see where this conversation goes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prerna ma'am, and thank you to all the three speakers who shared their insights on different topics of today's theme, which is the issue of domestic violence in the pandemic of COVID-19. So after this segment, we'll move to our open discussion. So in this open discussion segment, we invite all the people in the session present today to speak whatever they have on the topic without any fear of judgment. We all are here to learn, and we all are here to express our opinions and discuss and debate various dimensions of today's topic. So if anyone in the chat box would want to ask a question or want to say something, you can raise your hand with the Zoom raise hand option, or you can unmute yourself to start speaking. Okay, so I'll start first with some of my observations on what Smita ma'am talked about. So what Smita ma'am talked about reminded me of one of the articles I had read, I think like a week back. It was about routine activities theory. So it is a criminology theory where it talks about if a person commits a crime, if they're used to it, if they get used to something, then they'll continue doing it again, and it becomes a part of their life. And a lot of things that you talked about, ma'am, women became vulnerable targets, and there was a lack of any help from the outside world. They were there were no guardians. So those are some of the aspects which were actually talked about in that theory. So, but unfortunately or fortunately, that theory hasn't been applied or analyzed in the Indian context yet. And in fact, there is a very little literature available on the impact of domestic violence in the Indian context, with in consonance with all the different theories of the world. So I now request all the speakers to talk about whether do you think, in your opinion, this criminology theory of routine activities will apply very in the strict sense to domestic violence in a pandemic or not, or do you have any other new perspective or any other new theory which would be more apt in this context?
I just had a couple of things to add, not particularly with regard to your question. So I think maybe perhaps the others could respond to that. But as Prerna was discussing, some of the the unreliability of systems in place to deal with case of domestic violence, particularly with the expectations from the police response, and also what other governmental responses during the pandemic have done. I mean, beginning with the police, this is just perhaps a slightly I mean, I don't know if it's an amusing anecdote, but recently I was interacting with a few judicial officers. These were um, district level judges typically, and we were talking about uh, cases of child abuse in certain contexts, and in what the pandemic has meant with regard, meant for families. But we also spoke about domestic violence and what kind of response exists for domestic violence cases. One of the things I said was that, I mean, we know what kind of response typically exists when you go to the police to register a complaint under the Domestic Violence Act, or you're trying to seek like a protection order or something of the sort. Typically the police will respond saying, next time you come, guarantee we'll definitely do something. This time just sort of adjust madi or adjust karlo, whatever is the the response in that context. And there was just smiles across the online session, because everybody was clearly in agreement. And these were judicial officers who also knew, because this has also been their experience of what response exists. So at one level, there seems to be at least some consensus that the police are not particularly effective in responding in many cases, simply because they require the person to come back, and they try to manage or compromise the situation at least the first second time, and ask the person to come back later. So that tells us a lot about what response exists when somebody who's been a victim of domestic violence has to muster the courage to go to a police officer and actually make that complaint. That itself doesn't happen after one incident of domestic violence in most cases. Most cases, it takes a while before a person gets to the police station. And then to receive this response dissuades more and more people from actually trying to access any form of justice. That's one. And as Prerna was talking, I was also thinking about how the state has responded in during the pandemic, and how much thought has gone into some of the response. Certainly, COVID has required us to take measures for public safety and there are epidemiological decisions to take. That, and there's a lot of research that suggests we need to have a lockdown, or we perhaps need to stop transmission in certain contexts, in certain public spaces. All of that is true. But a lot of the thinking has also not necessarily been informed by evidence, and this has direct implications for something like domestic violence. For example, there's been no credible research to suggest that closing schools was an effective intervention to curb the transmission of COVID-19. The reason schools were closed is because of plague era thinking. As a response to the plague, schools had to be closed because that was an effective way to curb the transmission of the plague, because it also spread through children. That wasn't necessarily true for COVID, and later on, during, after all these measures were implemented, a bunch of modeling studies actually revealed that closing schools didn't significantly break the chain of transmission. It didn't actually reduce the transmissibility of COVID, simply because children were not prime carriers of COVID. If they were, then it would certainly have made a big difference. But what has happened as a result, you've adopted an intervention that doesn't really address your issue, but has consequences for what the child is supposed to deal with when they spend more time at home with lesser access to school. Because access to school doesn't simply mean I get to spend time away from my abusive parent. Access to school also means that if I get hit severely, or if I'm injured severely, there's somebody in school who might take notice and say that this is wrong. They may not necessarily go to the cops and make a complaint or try to approach legal help, but they will at least contact the parents to try to find out what's wrong. Maybe that affords the child little more protection in the house because the parents are wary of somebody finding out. So access to child services in many cases, and these are services that have nothing to do with reporting of violence or whatever, any kind of service, whether it's to your pediatrician, whether it's your school teacher, or any person who's interacting with the child, the more access to services that children have in these contexts, the more protected they may be in a domestic violence situation, simply because there are more people who might know something is wrong and have a chance to speak to the parents or report on behalf of the child. So when all of those spaces are locked, your schools are closed for not without sufficient basis for closing schools. Many other services are halted because people are spending more and more time at home. Then that also means more opportunities for the person who's abusing, the perpetrator, to perpetrate more violence upon their children, or the wife, your spouse at home. And that also means not just more opportunities for violence, but also lesser opportunities for reporting, because reporting doesn't always happen only through the victim. It happens through service providers also. So I think that's just a couple of things. Yeah.
I would like to add a few more here. Saurabh and Prerna, both of you talked about, we as an Indian society, we do not approach the legal system so easily, right? We have to be pushed to the wall, and there is no other way out. That is when the whole issue becomes a legal issue. Yes, this is because of the social outlook what we have. So what happened, what I feel is this has been my experience, in the sense when I interact with the working women around the COVID and the lockdown and work from home. Actually working, you might have seen that the number of women working in all sectors, all levels, stratas of the society has increased. Everyone has an opportunity to go out and work. And in many cases, when you go higher up the strata, it is not a requirement financially for them to work. It is an escape. It is getting that oxygen, what they do not get within the four walls. So they go out there and they find it. And that was closed. During the lockdown period, that was closed. And the children also. For that time period, you forget everything and you go there and you recoup and you come back. That is how I think majority of the victims lead their life in this country. That was snatched by the COVID pandemic. So, and that had an impact in a very different way. Like, yes, they had mental problems, in the sense severe health problems. We can see that. Because, after a long time, because I also worked for a long time, the first year, after the first wave, it was a lot of online work I used to do. So we really did not get to meet anybody, face to face. But after that, when I met them, I felt as if they have aged 3 to 4 years. We could see that in their face, and it was a shock to me. Initially, it was a big shock. But now I can, relate to it, and I can understand that it is a trauma they might have undergone within the walls. So that's how it has affected.
Definitely, ma'am. So I'd like to ask a question to all the panelists as well as anyone who would like to answer. So in both Saurabh sir's and Prerna ma'am's presentation, I noticed that you guys laid an emphasis on that women are not just the only victims. We have children and we have other people who are less recognized as being the silent sufferers of domestic violence during the pandemic. So I'd like to divert the attention here to male victims of domestic violence, especially young minor male children who are definitely during the pandemic were the silent sufferers, and the degree to which that was reported was extremely meager. We still know of women sufferers, and we know of minor girls who were the victims of domestic violence, but there is very little literature or research or even news articles, for that matter, on what would the plight be of a young boy who doesn't know how to approach the system, because they're definitely not equipped with that knowledge, or that even the differentiation of what is right or wrong. What would the plight of that small boy would be? And this the plight of like young boys who are victims of domestic violence is not a thing which is new and which just happened during domestic violence, but it has been going on and it has been wrapped under the carpets since decades now. And time and again we ask this question to ourselves, that why is no one reporting, or why is no one highlighting these minor male children? Forget adult males speaking about their suffering because of external factors, but why is no one reporting or no one talking about the misery of minor male children?
If I can quickly respond to that, Tusharika, the answer to, for some people, is usually surprising, but the answer to the question you just asked is the patriarchy. Because people often, because people will get into very interesting conversations with you. They'll talk about how men are also abused, boys are also abused at home, and you'll say, yes, of course, certainly that's true. And then they go off into a tangent about how, so it is not just some feminist issue, it's not just some woman's issue. Okay, even men, violence is violence at home. But there's certain irony to that, and I think we could perhaps find a little bit humorous, because the fact that men don't report violence at home, or that we don't talk about male victims of domestic violence, is also because of the patriarchy and expectations from who the man or who a boy is supposed to be at home. So because the boy, the man, is understood to typically be the aggressor, or at least the person in a dominant position or a position of power, it's easier to understand you as the aggressor, or at least to understand that you perhaps have more agency than anybody else in the house. So you, by definition, cannot be a victim. How can you be a victim? So if that's the perspective, then we've already decided who the victim is supposed to be. We've already decided who the aggressor is supposed to be, and we exist in a world where only this reality is visible, and context is just thrown out the window. I mean, it's a bit trite to say, but like, context is genuinely king in every single circumstance that we can imagine. So the answer to the question is actually because of the expectations. Again, we go back to that conversation, the expectations of who's supposed to be a victim and who's not supposed to be a victim. I think there are interesting analogies, if anybody is interested to look. I mean, there are interesting analogies in sexual abuse, which is an area that I've done some work in. In the context of sexual abuse, we often see this, because sexual offenses are typically viewed as special crimes against women by many people in our governmental and judicial systems, there is a lack of understanding of how sexual abuse happens, why it happens, what context it happens in, and what are the different kinds of sexual offenses that can take place. So when you don't understand that and you have a certain perception of what sexual offenses are, then you leave entire swaths of people without any kind of legal recourse or any kind of access to justice. This was revealed to us. I mean, there's so many Supreme Court cases to talk about that have spoken about the need for gender neutral provisions against sexual offenses. You look at our only legislation on child sexual abuse in the country, the POCSO Act. The POCSO Act also, there was a lot of discussion on it having to be gender neutral, simply because the research had told us that we don't have an understanding of sexual offenses, and that the law has been made in a very gendered and an inaccurate way. Because and again, this is something that's been around for a while. 2007 was the first year in which, and this was when our Ministry of Women and Child Development wasn't a separate ministry. It was just like a small junior ministry to the Ministry of Human Resources. So this is a while ago. In 2007, there was a nationwide study on child abuse conducted over 13 states with a lot of adult respondents talking about their childhood experiences and so on. That study shocked a lot of people, not because of the extent of abuse, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, and whatever, but also because of who was affected by the abuse. Especially with sexual offenses, that studies show that in terms of different kinds of offenses, male children actually there were more male children who were victimized than female children in terms of different kinds of sexual offenses. But in terms of the severity of offenses, female children were generally observed to be more victimized in terms of numbers than male children were. This is, again, I mean, different studies may tell you different things, but this is a relatively more representative study. But the point is that it at least told us that our assumptions about who's again supposed to be a victim aren't true, because there clearly there's a whole section of children who had no protection simply because they weren't even conceptualized in the framing of the law. So that also applies to domestic violence, certainly. And the only answer there is context. Like, the context to every kind of problematic circumstance has to be looked at. And so far, if this conversation that we're having today is supposed to answer eventually the question of, what can we do then? If this is true, then what can we do? And the answer has to be systematic assessment. That at any point in time, this legal system is required to intervene if there's a complaint or there's a suspicion of any sort. We have to have a way of systematically evaluating every home and family to ensure that we know what the context is, and that context in many cases will typically be gendered abuse against the woman and the girl in the house, because typically violence, I mean, a majority of the violence does happen against women and girl children. But what happens if you have a systematic method of evaluation is we also are able to catch those cases that we may consider to be the exception. But I'm sure if you go to a child, a male child who's grown up in a house with severe physical or sexual abuse, and you ask him what his experience is, and then our response is, oh, but you just wait for a bit. We understand you have problems, but you are the exception. The rule is actually a certain kind of violence. That child is not going to appreciate your characterization of their whole life. So I think, just to respond to your question, I mean, that is, it's not a question of domestic violence being, men are not talked about in our conversation, or domestic violence, or domestic violence is not only a female issue. That's not the point. The point is that context is important. Yeah.
And
I think. Oh yeah, sorry, go for it.
Sorry, just to add on to that, I think queer relationships, right? We see a lot of intimate partner violence, and I see this a lot in the news as well, is among gay men, right? It's because of the rampant homophobia. There are a lot of cases where, and I've had friends themselves go through this, where strangers that they meet through hookup apps end up just really hurting the other person. And it could be due to homophobia, it could be their own lack of understanding of their own sexuality, or and obviously there are a lot of factors that you could attribute to the cause of this, right? And and when this happens, you can't even go to the law, because I mean, for the longest time, the law itself considered the entire act of performing homosexual sexual acts is illegal. And even now, I don't think the police takes you seriously when you go and report these crimes. So in these cases, then there is even a lack of statistical numbers for you to even begin systematically addressing this right now. So then then even if, say, you bring up this conversation after reading this in the newspaper, it's going to get laughed at. It's going to get, because there is a whole culture of even mocking homosexuality, and there have been violent cases even among lesbian women and other types of queer relationships, because just of the lack of understanding of sexuality as a spectrum, and just sexual well-being as part of sex education is so extremely lacking, that intimate partner violence among the LGBTQ community is rampant. And I mean, I'm not qualified enough to talk about the violence that trans people go through. I mean, Bt Venkatesh sir is a lot more well-versed with that aspect of things. But I mean, these are all vastly underreported areas of domestic violence, and I mean, it's honestly a shame that even law does very little to protect them. And so then how do we even have this conversation, right? How do you even begin providing a redressal system for these issues?
Yeah, also, I think domestic violence, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, also, I think domestic violence, when looked at it from this patriarchal lens, as Saurabh mentioned, you see that, young boys are treated and they're asked to man up, and that the whole idea of them being victims is not even considered, because that's how life is. That's how they have to be. And I think coming back to the first question that Tusharika mentioned, I think this will be like a continuous process. They'll think that they have to make sure they are coercive with their partners, their in and around their environment. So I think especially pandemic, what included, as here I'm speaking about everyone, women, men, children, everything. I think you being together in the same household, between those same walls. I think Smita ma'am also mentioned this idea that you're so frustrated seeing them all the time. See, how much ever we say there is an aspect of love in a family, all those things, definitely yes. But at the same time, you see that there's no refreshment. You don't go out, you don't learn things, see other people and come back. So essentially, it so happens that you're looking at the routine behaviors, and especially with women, it so happens the whole household ka work is, the load is on her. You have to literally cook all 3 meals because everyone's staying home. You have to clean everything that's happening. If the woman is working from home, you'll also have to do that too. So essentially there is that stress. With the children, I think the stress that children have gone through, especially these kids in their formative years who have never had human experience, when they when they front this kind of violence, they think that this is world. That is how they tend to grow. That is how they feel like, okay, coercive idea is it. So I think these gender norms that we have has been, affecting domestic violence so much, at least with respect to urban societies and people who have access to social media, TV series and movies. It staying at home, probably for the urban elite, the financial stress isn't much of an issue as of now. But if you look at, there are 2 things. It's not the financial stress, but the emotional and mental health issues that we are facing because of we being influenced from the media, being influenced from series and Indian TV serials, and how the patriarchy prevails, that, women, how much ever they go through, they adjust. I think Saurabh sir mentioned about police, right? Even during the pandemic, they were busy with all other things. With nothing else, they don't concentrate on this. Think about them being busy and they come back again. But I think it's the practical issue. Say a victim goes to the police station and she says, I'm experiencing this in a pandemic. She might have to come back because, of course, the police is not going to do anything at that first time. Imagine if her family finds out she was at the police station. The violence increases. So I think it adds up. And the other issue is, because of the pandemic, there is no, where do I go? That is the question mark, right? all literally hotels were closed, PGs were closed, people were thrown out of hostels as college students itself. So I think it became such an issue. And women, I know people my age were forced to get married. So that is kind of a kind of domestic violence. I know a few people from my friend circle who were hit by their fathers to, force them to get married because nothing's happening. Your education is online, you're not able to concentrate. So I think this whole idea of this media and consumption of media and financial stress, especially with the middle class structure that we are in, the whole proliterate class, we are so we were trying to stick to finance, we're trying to make sure that we are not laid off our jobs. That also comes up in this whole pandemic domestic violence situation, because one, you don't have a job, you probably would resort to alcohol. And there were times during the lockdown where they closed that too. So essentially, it's this frustration you take on the presumably weaker sex at home. So I guess all these things add up. And one more issue with children, right? As I mentioned, that they look at this domestic violence and they probably continue. Coming back to the first question that Tusharika mentioned, it's like a cycle. Once you feel like, okay, this is what is happening. See, we've been at home for the past 2.5 years. I'm pretty sure it would have instilled so much engraved into their brains that this is it. This is how you get through the world. Violence is the only way. Probably there are times when the mother would be okay with the son hitting him too. I remember reading a news article from the Hindu somewhere in Chennai, where there's a kid who is around 6-7 years old. He starts burning his mom with a lighter and all those things, and mom's okay because it's her child. She knows that her child is frustrated, and this the thing, it's kind of, you're used to it so much that you're probably gaslighting yourself, that you're like, okay, this is it, this is happening, and I don't have a place to go out. And there is aspect of, I think, affection mixed. If I go out during the pandemic, who is going to take care of my family? So I think it's just a mix of things that people go through, and the pandemic has been worse for, I would still consider it's worse for women, because the gravity of the issue here with domestic violence is pretty huge. And even I remember, at least though marital rape is expressly defined, and it's just it's a debatable topic, our hospitals were overburdened so much that even if a person has gruesome and grievous hurt through domestic violence, they weren't able to get the proper medical attention. So I think it's just mix of issues that we had during the pandemic. Yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, Gargi, go ahead.
Yeah, Prerna ma'am just spoke about queer relationship and how it got affected. I have a number of friends who identifies themselves as queer, and most of them do not really stay with their families because of personal issues. And during pandemic, most of the hostels, PGs and rented apartments, they were closed. Like they had to return to their home, their place, and they have gone through an incredible amount of mental, physical, and emotional torture from their household. And even the police and the courts, they were so busy with other things. They really don't have time for these things. And more than this, the hijras, the sex workers, they were affected the most. And the court, the police, everyone was so busy with other things. No one really could help them in any way during the pandemic. They have suffered so much. And can anyone just speak about this, like how? Hello?
We can hear you.
Could you just rephrase that last bit? Sorry, I didn't catch that fully.
Yeah, so the hijras, the sex workers, they have faced these things more than anyone else, I think, because they had no earnings during the pandemic because the streets were closed, and they don't even get proper aid from the police and from the courts, and everyone just laughed at them every time. And even in normal situations, they do not really get proper legal advice or proper legal help or proper help from the police. And during COVID, it got worse and worse, and no one could really help them. So, can someone like shed a bit of light on this, please?
I don't have anything of significance to say on this, because I think I just want to say that this is a question probably for BT sir, simply because if we're talking about, I just want to mention that because if we're talking about particularly sex work, especially within the transgender community, I think BT sir could probably shed some light on violence within the community itself, especially within the context of sex work. I think sir would have a lot to say. I mean, what has been the impact of COVID on that, especially for the transgender community in many cases where there is also violence, especially with regard to sex workers. So I mean, I don't know what the impact of the pandemic has been, but I think sir, you could probably say a few things on this.
Pandemic has been such an impact on persons who are vulnerable. In fact, it's something which is reports which go to show that the domestic violence that we see, it grew multifold because of various factors that changed during pandemic. Suddenly one fine morning, everybody were at home. So the abuser was at home. Abuser would not leave the place. Suddenly the kind of economic distress that the millions of families suffered exacerbated the situation. It was something which became more vocal. The third, in fact, Ms. Mita was talking about, and all of you are talking about, was the kind of alcoholism, the frustrations. In fact, they had such amount of impact on women. Virtually, she had no space to breathe. It was choking. That has been there are a huge number of reports in respect of pandemic and domestic violence and the challenges that the women faced. Now, when you look at this construct, every community which is vulnerable was so badly affected. In fact, the challenges was that if someone took some courage, said that I'm going to challenge it, seek redressal, tragedy was that there was no forum to go to. The police were busy in maintaining law and order. The courts were shut, except a case where it is for bail, the court would be open. For any other purposes, court is closed. It is shut. The fear of pandemic had virtually closed every possible door to the people. In fact, there was one a strange instance. The fear factor of the pandemic was so much. It's out of place, but I feel it demonstrated an example that a person committed a murder in Bangalore, went to police station with a knife, reported to the police that he committed murder. Police told him to come after 1 week. The fear of pandemic was such, they were even unwilling to arrest the person who had committed a murder. You can imagine what would have been the situation of a woman seeking redressal. What would have been the situation of a person who is a transgender seeking redressal? What would have been the situation of a person belonging to queer communities seeking redressal? First, many of the people who are extremely vulnerable, be it women, children, transgender community, the whole spectrum of queer community, sex workers, all of them are by rule vulnerable, and their complaints they find it difficult to get a complaint registered. These were the days where it was virtually impossible. The frustration in the family, the frustrations of economic situation, the frustration of not being able to go out, frustration of not there being any entertainment for the person, all these frustrations just were heaped more particularly on communities which are very, very vulnerable. I think that's the challenge. Why? That's the reason why we kept the title of today's subject was resuscitating. So difficult. It was choking. It was heartbreaking. They had no space at all even to survive. In fact, many of them have taken their lives. Many of them have suffered such degrees of indignities unimaginable. And many of them, as someone in the place said, this aged, in that I see them. Because we are a practicing lawyer, we see someone from these communities, women, be it fair, any one of them. I have seen them age at such pace, difficult. Their orientation is affected. Their ability to communicate restricted. It's not one. The challenges are so many, and it continues to be so even as on this day. Even as on this day, there are few complaints. You may not believe that it was the time, because we are practicing lawyers, that was the time hardly any complaint of domestic violence could reach the court. No cases of divorce were filed in the court. No cases of maintenance were filed in the court. Can you imagine that? It's huge number of litigation that happens on any given day. It was shut. Doors were shut from that of a magistrate court to the Supreme Court. Impossible for anyone to access. More particularly, those people who are economically in a difficult situation, there was no possibility of any seeking assistance at all. There was no counselor, no one to listen to, no one to advise them, because even if I were to give an advice, where she would go? Good number of offices. This is also an example, just as an example, forget the global scenario. Nearly 7,000 to 8,000 lawyers, practicing, litigating lawyers in Bangalore, moved to their villages. And these are the lawyers who work in magistrate court, who work in city civil court, who work in family court, who work in high court, but majority of them work in trial courts. And these are the lawyers who are willing to take these cases at affordable cost of litigation. They just left courts. So the compounding of all these factors has made life so difficult for millions of them in this country. If I'm telling it from an experience in a city like Bangalore, you can as well imagine what would have been the conditions in other places in this country. Impossible. This violence got unreported. It became part of it. And a woman told me, a client came to me and told me, he said, why did you not lodge a complaint? She said that, sir, if at all I would get pandemic, if I'm affected by COVID, that would have been a deliverance for me, because there'll be no more. In quick time, I don't have to commit an act of committing suicide. It helps me. She said it was a deliverance. Unfortunately, I was unlucky. You can't hear these kind of stories. I do not know how many of them are there across India. How many of them are there across the globe? It's not something which is domestic violence. I would like to keep reiterate that every third woman in this world faces one or other forms of domestic violence in her life. Millions of girls in this country have been married off at one of the worst times for a child marriage was pandemic. The only space the children had was that there was some nutrition that was available in school that would get them the food. So the child labor increased multifold. The children being driven to sex work grew multifold. Children being married off at a tender age grew multifold. It was unimaginable. We are yet to get statistics regarding the kind of violence that has taken place on these aspects. No consent, none of it. And it does not mean that it's happening only in the most poorer sections of society. It happened in every section of the society. And there is a need now to account for the same. There is a need now to record, document these aspects of concern. There is a crying need to see what exactly the situation is. I think that's something which is very essential. In fact, the great number of cases we come across the intimate partner violence among living relationship in urban spaces, and more particularly the queer community. In queer community, the marriage is not recognized. So they are in living relationship. And despite all the aspects which we have, many of them, if you were to look at the finest, most popular among the transgender persons, they have faced domestic violence. They have been emotionally, physically, financially, sexually, in all respects abused. Their stories are not heard. In fact, when we look at the larger picture, we get to see stories of some women, but when it comes down to the queer community, there's absolutely no space at all to express anything. That's one of the tragic situations. Good number of them have died. Good number have lost their lives. Good number of them have been driven to such situation. They have been mental wrecks. It's a reality that we have. That pandemic, not just lives were lost, mental health were lost for so many of them. So many of them. Loss of orientation, loss of self-esteem, saw the kind million driven to depression. And that's something which is the challenge that we have. There is a need to resuscitate. So there is a need to account for these communities. There's a need to record. I think that's one of the things which I would request more organizations, individuals to be open, keep your hearing. In fact, the very purpose of this Reach Lawyer Source program that we have initiated is to create the responsibility among people, be a listener. The men, women, children who are crying to tell their story to someone, that they could unburden themselves. There's no one to speak to. There are a number of people who are in need of counseling, that all of us need to learn the skills, try to help. The number of women, queer, sex workers, everyone needing advice, legal advice, how to go about the same. In fact, Rich Lawyer is, the very purpose of this program is that we have put across in every banner which you see, is that if you need an advice, write to us, send a mail to askreachlawyer@gmail.com, whichever the language you are in. We'll find someone to translate it and tell it to us. Send a mail to askreachlawyer@gmail.com. Today we have enrolled some 250 plus lawyers across India, close to 100 lawyers in Karnataka, who are part of this network in India alone. And there are a number of advocates who have been practicing on this across the globe, in Australia, in US, in Europe, in Africa. They have been trying to help on these processes. So I think there's a need that we create these spaces. There's a need that we need to take these voices to a larger audience, larger number of people. So these discussions are essential. Therefore, for the first time in all 3 areas where we were doing a program on Women's Day, we said that first and foremost would be an open discussion and debate on a subject of this nature for 8 long days. Yes, there's so many dimensions to it, so many aspects to it. There is so much need to be discussed, thought, understood, shared, new ideas. In fact, today's discussion, thanks to every one of you, was so meaningful because it came out with such kind of aspects, such dimensions of the subject of violence, more particularly domestic violence, as against children, as against women, as against young adolescents, you name, all of them faced. Queer, every aspect was discussed. I'm extremely, immensely thankful to everyone here for that kind of a presentation. But this is a process which each of us need to take and ensure that people get to know that, yes, there is a need to help. There is a need to listen to. If somebody is in distress, just listen to them. You don't be judgmental. Stop being judgmental. Stop being judgmental. One of the major challenges we have in our society is that we are judgmental the moment we see a woman complaining. The moment if she is silent, she says she must speak up. If she speaks up, she says she's too loud. If she says that, starts shouting that, no, I'm being violated in such a manner, yeah, I think this kind of an attitude, she is the one who had made it herself. It's her own making that she is in such a situation. So being judgmental has become easy. Why we do that is that we, by nature, want to avoid any responsibility. We don't want to take any responsibility that someone is making a statement. Someone is making a statement that she needs support. She needs someone to listen to. She needs a counseling. She needs someone to give her some advice. We, with all the expertise and the skills that we have, most of us, one need not be a lawyer. He said, I'm not a lawyer. How can I? You could have heard her out. You could have made her life a little easier because you had an opportunity to listen to her. If you were a counselor, you could have told her that, yes, don't get into difficult situation. How many lives could have been saved? While we see that there have been deaths in pandemic, we have lost count how many committed suicide. We have no count of how many committed suicide. And we have little or no respect for those who committed suicide. So this is something which needs to be discussed, debated, and accounted for. I think that's one of the major reasons where Reach Lawyer Source is driving that. This aspect we would like to continue to work on, and many more days to come. And this month, we are going to have more and more and more discussions. And I'm so happy that this effort of Reach Lawyer Source is supported by so many of you, and more particularly the younger generation. It's a joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So I think as a concluding remark, I think all of us would definitely agree that there has been a great deal of turmoil throughout classes, across different communities, be it transgender community, queer community, women, children, and even us who are so-called privileged. And there's one thing that we cannot do is compare the sufferings. Everyone has suffered in some or the other way, be it financial aspects. Some of our parents have lost their jobs, the children have suffered violence, the women have been discriminated against. There have been people who haven't been getting their 3 meals a day, probably not even 2 meals a day. So there has been a lot of turmoil and psychological distress that has happened throughout this entire pandemic, which is still continuing, by the way. And there can be more waves that would come, and we're still somehow recovering from the after effects of what the pandemic made our lives into, and it has transformed us as individuals and as a global community to a great extent. One thing I think, what I would consider as a solution to all the different dimensions that we talked about today is like a proper sex education system. Even Prerna ma'am talked and mentioned about the lack of sex education, which often caused these issues and often caused the lack of realization of what is right or wrong at a young age. So if sex education or a basic differentiation of good touch and bad touch, which is most of the times prevalent in the Western countries, if something of that small basic nature is also taught in our curriculum, in our education system to children, and basic gender sensitization and difference between what is sex and what is gender, these small changes in our education system at a foundational primary level, I think, in my personal opinion, would do a great deal of work organically. Like, we wouldn't have to make more laws, we wouldn't have to change a lot of laws which run on the pretext of social transformation. We would achieve the topics that we're talking about, the solutions that we're talking about organically, if our children understand these issues from a young age and they are sensitive to these issues, and they continue being socially aware and sensitive uh, individuals to not just their peers, but each and every community or person that they interact with on a daily life. So I think that's my concluding remark, and I thank everyone for coming here today and sharing your insights on the different dimensions of today's topic. If anyone has anything to add, this is an open forum and a no judgment zone, so you can definitely share your views now.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. I think I would agree with the whole idea of way forward in having sexual education as a a step to curb the idea of domestic violence is a pretty good thing. And also, I think even Saurabh sir mentioned this idea of patriarchy. I think the whole violence thing will remain until we get. I don't know. I'm probably being too idealistic, but this idea of getting out of patriarchal cycle is essential, and I think it is. It's a dire need that we respect people for who they are. In Indian society, it so seems that you respect elders, but not for the person they are. So essentially, it feels like, as I mentioned before, if you're hit by your parent, you feel like we are putting them on a pedestal. So like whatever they do, we do. So essentially, we don't look at them as humans, be it teachers or parents, essentially, or elders as such. We try to feel that whatever they do as elders, it's an important thing. I think that is one more thing that has to be, get into the system and bring change socially. Another point is we've never had this moral, ethical topics discussed in schools, right? We don't know. It's, of course, good touch, bad touch is one thing, but also the idea of very trivial things that we have. I think the other day we were mentioning about this, the knee length, the skirt ka knee length, or girls dressing up in a certain way, having different colored toys, which are very small, trivial things, but at the same time, it's also propagating the idea of you separating them and you saying that, okay, they are a weaker sex. Okay, we need protection, but why do we need protection? Because they are the ones who are the victims of this. So essentially, I think there are very smaller things, right? This idea of having a separate part for ladies in metro, in this thing. Of course, it is a short-term solution, but it's like a consolation for women. It's like, you go there now, why are you coming here? That's the same thing that happens with domestic violence also. It's like, you are good at cooking, why not cook? Why are you here? Why are you not dressed well? When you have a kurta, why are you not wearing that? It's more decent. I think that is something which are very smaller things that from school, if we tell them that you respect them as a human being, not because they are an artist, they are a teacher, they are your parent. No, it's the idea of them being human being. I think here it is not only about good touch or bad touch, it's about the good feel or bad feel about the person themselves. So essentially, I'm just trying to point out that the whole idea of respect, moral and ethical values also have to come into place.
Definitely, definitely.
Gaurav?
So just a final thought, because we were talking about non-judgmental. I heard the word non-judgmental be used multiple times, so that just reminded me of something. Professor Harsh Mandar had said something a while ago. I would also recommend everyone, please, because we've been discussing a lot of very interesting cases and sort of situations today. I would recommend that everyone reads his book called Fatal Accidents of Birth. It's called Fatal Accidents of Birth because of what Rohit Vemula had written in his letter. The letter that I think all of us have read today, where he talked about his identity as being his fatal accident of birth. So the book is named after that, but it has many interesting stories about adversity, violence, struggle, and the response to that in very different contexts. Some of those contexts deal with incidents of domestic violence, like this woman who was married off quite early, was a victim of domestic violence. Her husband was responsible for also he was affected by HIV, and then subsequently she was also affected by HIV, which contributed to her being stigmatized further, distance from her family. So I mean, a lot of interesting stories like that. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is Professor Harsh had said a while ago that empathy is not the absence of feeling; it's the absence of curiosity, and that must also extend to understanding a context like domestic violence, especially when we talk about something like adopting a non-judgmental attitude. One of the stories in Fatal Accidents of Birth is about this family that has like no money at all. It's a very difficult situation, and they sell their child to this uncle who wants to adopt this child, but they essentially sell their child to him because they can't take care of the child, and they felt that this would be the best option. This happened a few years ago. The Indian media went berserk, reported about this family that sold their child. What kind of a demon sells their own child to somebody else, and made a big hula about it. There were politicians who went and visited and said up more things about the family, and eventually the child was repatriated back to the family. And what happened to that situation, because they had no money, eventually a couple of years later, I think they discovered the child had died because of severe starvation and starvation related physical ailments, disease, and so on. So ultimately the child died because the family simply did not have the capacity to take care. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this may seem a little tangential, but again, recently we were talking about was speaking to child protection functionaries, were talking about child marriage. And something I was saying, I kept talking about how decisions for children should be taken in the child's best interest. We were talking about abusive familial context, abusive home context, and the fact that there are laws against child marriage, and that child marriage affects the family in this way, and we should all try to take decisions in the best interest of children, and so on. And this one child protection function is getting a bit irritated with me constantly talking about the best interest of the child. He said, what do you think, if the family does not have any money, especially during context of COVID, family incomes are at an all-time low. This is an issue of scarcity of resources. They don't think that their daughter will necessarily have the same job opportunities that their son will. And in the area where they live, they're right, that their daughter will not have the same opportunities their son will. And so to them, this seems like the best route to actually provide some assistance to their daughter, because they think if their daughter gets married off, she has some shot at a life that is better than at least, starvation or near starvation. Now, the point isn't that this is a correct perspective, but the point is that the situation of something like child marriage or girl children being abused in the home, especially during COVID, where they're not allowed to attend their classes, even if it's online or whatever. The solution to that isn't necessarily to demonize the family or who we think is the perpetrator also, because many a times, especially with domestic violence, a lot of domestic violence is also facilitated by necessity. There is underlying necessity to a lot of instances of violence. So to curb, while we talk about patriarchy and its impact on the family and the roles and responsibilities of girl children and a wife versus the husband, male children, all of that, It's also important to talk about what role necessity plays and what role a financial crunch can play, because financial distress is not just an added thing. Financial distress can have many implications, and many times some of the things that we feel very easy to judge, we feel very judgmental of, those are also a result of vulnerabilities for the family. The point that even in that context, this abusive father who's reprimanding his daughter, trying to get her to do more home chores, he possibly believes that he's doing the best for his family with the limited resources he has. He may be incorrect, and what he's doing is certainly abusive, but solution is not necessarily, it doesn't help anybody. The solution is only judgmental. I was just thinking about this because you were talking about non-judgmental. The solution lies in addressing the family level vulnerabilities. If there's financial distress, till you address that financial distress, you have no chance of addressing domestic violence. And apart from that, of course, there are other things we could talk about, something like sex education in a different context. We could talk about gender sensitization, helping the family understand that there are ways in which their daughters can also have the same opportunities their sons do. All of that is true, but since we were talking about non-judgmental attitude, I thought this was just something to keep in mind, that our aggressors aren't necessarily demons.
Yeah, true. I think especially with this idea of finance, right? It's like an emergency situation of a state, that everything's just suspended when there's a financial crisis. Also, with respect to Indian society, there's this norm that you don't talk about whatever happens in your family with someone else. That is super prevailing, because it's like you don't share things with your friends because you don't know how people are. You don't know how your family is because you are experiencing different forms of violence and gaslighting. I forgot to add that point before. I think this idea of you confiding in people, I think with respect to media and whole strange websites that we have, like Omegle and everything, where you meet strangers and talk to them, at least our generation, the so Gen Z or millennials, we kind of say that talking to strangers, you find more solace than actually people you know. So essentially we have to get this norm that you let out whatever is happening. Most of the times, I think as Smita ma'am also mentioned, that a kid goes to school and there is someone sees her, someone sees the kid, someone knows what's happening. Similarly, I think if we are able to let it out with someone without judgments, it being a safe space, that would make a change. Indian families have this idea where nothing should be let out of the family. It's a family affair. I think if you, watch the Burari death series on Netflix, you realize that this is the issue there. There's so many stuff going on, but you still stick to the family criterias and everything. Yeah.
Smita, madam?
Yes, sir. I agree with Mamata. I think when we talk about the different levels of violence, or what we say, most of the cases, it's not a physical violence, it's a mental violence, right? So here, creating a platform for them, or an opportunity for these people who are undergoing this trauma to come and speak out, itself empowers them and gives them the strength to face or say no, because many cases, they do not say no. They don't have that strength. They just silently endure what is happening. So therapy, counseling, these kind of things, which are actually not very much prevalent in our society, or rather people shy away from all this. This has to, be taken in a different light, and people have to be given opportunities. So I feel that can help them a lot, right? So in many cases, it's us, or if we are the victims, whoever is the victim, they have to stand against that, right? Only then you can find the right solution. We cannot always run to the police or somebody else who will come to help us. The help should come from within us. So that strength, I think, can be built when we can create, that's a wonderful platform what Bt sir is creating, where people can really come and talk about their problems. And as Mamta said, why do we like speaking to strangers? Is because they are not judgmental, right? Because they don't know anything about us. so they cannot pass any judgment on us, whatever be their ulterior motive later on. But at that moment, what we want is somebody who doesn't pass any comment or a judgment on us. Yes.
Thank you. I think the word need to be spreading. I think the Reach Lawyer Search program, I request all of you to share these ideas, share these views, share your views, and share that such facilities available. One can write to us. We'll be in a position to provide some amount of advice. We will be in a position to at least lead you to someone who can give you an advice. That's some kind of spaces that need to be created, some kind of quality that can be improved, and we can create a large volunteer force of some good listeners who are empathetic to these situations. I think that's the need of the hour at this point of time. While we have serious questions on the issues of patriarchy and other things, but this is a place where somewhere we need to begin. This is a place to begin, some place to begin. I think Reach Lawyer Search need to be spread. The word need to be spread to people. I think all of you be part of this movement. Yes, thank you.
Yes, sir. I think we all definitely can agree towards the end that we all just need an ear to hear, which is also the reason the author of Reach Lawyer Source program itself. We all just want to be viewed as individuals and not recognized by the background we come from, what gender we belong to, or which family we grew up in, who is my father, who is my mother. We want to be known for our individuality. We want to be seen as dignified individuals. And that's what the Reach Lawyer Source also talks about. So I thank all the speakers, all the panelists who spoke their insights and shared your experiences and your knowledge to the audience, and also to Mamta and Gargi for sharing your insights and opinions on today's topic. And to all the people who are watching us live on YouTube and Facebook and other platforms, we hope to see you tune into our other programs for the coming 5 days as well. So we hope you had a great session, and we hope to host you soon tomorrow with a new session and a new topic of discussion. So with this, I'd end today's session and request all the people who are in this session to turn on their cameras if possible, so that we can take a community picture.
Thank you, Smita. Thank you, Saurabh. And thanks, Prerna. She left, but it's been a great, great, great show. I know, I'm always sure of that. Always sure of that. Tomorrow we have a wonderful session by Ms. Shila Ramaswamy. She is a senior officer at the Project Samvad. She's the coordinator of the Project Samvad in Nimhans, Bangalore. She is going to speak. She is the expert on the field. She is going to speak on impact of domestic violence on children. It's one of the most important aspects. Many a time when we talk of domestic violence, we forget that the children are the only witnesses. Children are the assured victims in all these violence. They are at the receiving end. They're always at the receiving end. They have to make choices. Making choice is forced upon them. And we have seen a great number of cases of this nature. And tomorrow we have an expert on the field coming and talking to us. Be sure that you are there tomorrow by 7 o'clock. And the whole construct, the title of the subject is Liberating the Hurt Locker. The home is nothing less than a hurt locker. So we are meeting tomorrow, 7 p.m. Please, all of you join, spread the word, let everyone listen to. These are the dialogues from one of the finest experts that we are going to listen to, who have really great information to share. And this will be recorded and shared in the platforms in times to come. But listening to them at live is something which is an opportunity for you to see firsthand. See you tomorrow, 7 p.m. Thank you.